I used to think silence meant peace. Now it just means something is missing. The apartment isn't any different than it was before. Same couch. Same kitchen counter with the small crack near the corner. Same window where the light falls across the floor in the late afternoon. But none of it feels the same. There used to be a rhythm to things. Little routines that happened without thinking. Someone humming in the other room. A question shouted down the hallway. The sound of a door opening and closing at the end of the day. Now the place feels like it's holding its breath. I still sit at the same table most evenings. Out of habit, I guess. Sometimes I catch myself glancing toward the other chair like someone might still walk in and sit down. It's strange how quickly a life can split into two versions. There's the version you remember living. And the version you realize was actually happening. For a long time I couldn't figure out where the line was. The moment when everything quietly changed without me noticing. Looking back now, it feels obvious. But at the time it wasn't dramatic. There wasn't some explosive fight or obvious sign that something was wrong. It started with something small. The kind of thing most people would ignore. I remember noticing it and feeling a brief moment of discomfort. Not suspicion exactly. Just that strange feeling when something doesn't fit the way it should. Like when a picture frame on the wall is slightly crooked. You can't explain why it bothers you, but you know it does. I told myself it was nothing. People do that a lot when they trust someone. You convince yourself the uneasy feeling is your fault. That you're overthinking. That relationships require patience and understanding. So you adjust the frame in your mind and keep going. At least, that's what I did. There was a moment, I can see it clearly now, when I noticed something that didn't match the person I believed I knew. It wasn't proof of anything. Not even close. Just a detail. A small pause in a conversation. A message that seemed harmless on the surface. A tone that felt slightly different than usual. At the time I let it go. I told myself it didn't matter. But the strange thing about moments like that is they don't really disappear. They sit quietly in the back of your mind. Waiting. And once that first doubt exists, something changes inside you. You start noticing other things. Little shifts. Small absences. Conversations that feel slightly rehearsed. Nothing that could stand on its own as evidence. Nothing you could point to and say, this is the moment everything broke. But the feeling grows anyway. And eventually you cross a line without realizing it. The line between trust and observation. Between believing someone and watching them. I didn't know it then, but that tiny moment of discomfort was the beginning of a different life. A life where certain words stop meaning what they used to. Where apologies sound different. Where, it meant nothing, suddenly becomes the most confusing sentence you've ever heard. Because when something truly means nothing, it usually doesn't have the power to destroy everything. If you've ever had a moment like that, where a single detail made your whole world start to feel slightly off, then you already know how these stories begin. And trust me, this one only gets worse from here. So if you're into real stories about betrayal, trust being broken, and the uncomfortable truths people don't like to talk about, make sure you subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray, hit like, and share the video with someone who loves these kinds of stories too. Because sometimes the smallest moment of doubt is the one that changes everything. And I didn't realize it yet, but I had already seen the first crack. When I think back to the beginning, nothing about it felt fragile. If anything, it felt steady. That's probably the hardest part to explain now. People like to imagine that broken relationships were always unstable, like there were warning signs everywhere if you just looked closely enough. But in the beginning, it didn't feel like that at all. It felt normal. We met through mutual friends during a small get-together. Nothing dramatic happened that night. No big moment where the room stopped and we instantly connected. It was simpler than that. We just kept ending up in the same conversations. The kind where you start talking about something ordinary and suddenly realize an hour has passed. At some point I remember thinking, this feels easy. Not exciting in a chaotic way. Just comfortable. After that we started seeing each other more often. At first it was casual. Coffee, short dinners, long walks that stretched later into the evening than either of us planned. Neither of us rushed anything. Looking back, I think that slow pace made it feel more real. There wasn't pressure or dramatic declarations. Just two people gradually becoming part of each other's routine. Eventually the routine started forming on their own. Weekend breakfasts. Late-night conversations about things that didn't really matter. Inside jokes that only made sense to the two of us. At some point I stopped thinking of it as dating and started thinking of it as my life. Trust didn't arrive all at once. It built itself quietly over time. Small things. Keeping promises. Showing up when you say you will. Remembering details from conversations weeks earlier. It's strange how powerful those small things are. They don't feel important while they're happening, but they slowly convince you that someone is dependable. And once that belief forms, it becomes the foundation for everything else. I remember thinking how rare it felt to be with someone who seemed emotionally steady. There were no dramatic arguments. No sudden disappearances. No games. If something bothered one of us, we talked about it. Or at least we thought we did. That's the thing about trust. It creates this quiet assumption that both people are living inside the same reality. You believe that what you see is what exists. Over time our lives started weaving together in ways that didn't require effort. We spent more time in the same spaces. Friends became shared friends. Plans naturally included both of us. And the future started appearing in conversations without either of us announcing it. Not in some grand, cinematic way. Just little comments. What should we do next summer? Maybe someday we'll. Those kinds of sentences. I didn't question any of it. Why would I? Everything felt balanced. If anything, I thought we were doing better than most couples we knew. There was a calmness between us that made the relationship feel durable. Solid. The kind of relationship you assume will last because nothing inside it feels unstable. I trusted her. Not the cautious kind of trust where you keep one eye open. The comfortable kind. The kind where you stop analyzing things. Where you stop wondering what someone might be doing when you're not around. Where you stop imagining hidden versions of their life. Because you believe there aren't any. I think that's what made it so easy to relax into the relationship. I didn't feel like I needed to guard anything. My attention, my time, my emotional energy, it all naturally flowed toward us building something together. And when someone believes they're building a future with you, they stop paying attention to the possibility that something else might be happening quietly beside it. At the time, I thought what we had was simple. Two people who trusted each other. Two people who were honest. Two people moving forward together without secrets. And for a long time, I believed that completely. Which is probably why, when things eventually started to shift, it took me far longer than it should have to notice. Over time the relationship stopped feeling like something new and started feeling permanent. Not officially permanent. We never had some dramatic moment where we said, "This is forever." But the way our lives were structured started to lean that direction. I planned things assuming she'd be there. She did the same, or at least it looked that way from my side. The strange thing about comfort is how quietly it changes your priorities. You stop measuring effort. You stop keeping score. You just assume both people are carrying the same weight. At least I assumed that. By then we had routines that felt almost automatic. Certain days we'd meet after work. Certain evenings were just understood as ours. If something interesting happened during the day, she was usually the first person I told. It became second nature. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I started leaning into the relationship more than I realized. Not in some dramatic, needy way. Just gradually. If a weekend plan came up, I'd check with her first before committing to anything else. If I had free time, my first thought was usually, maybe we'll do something together. I didn't notice the shift happening. It just felt natural. Looking back now, I think I had slowly started organizing my life around the idea that we were a team. Meanwhile, her life seemed to be expanding in different directions. She started getting busier. New projects. New commitments. More time spent with people I didn't know very well. None of it seemed suspicious. People's lives grow. That's normal. And whenever I asked about it, she had simple answers. Just work stuff. Helping a friend with something. Running around today. The explanations made sense on the surface. And because I trusted her, I never pressed very hard. But there were small changes in the rhythm between us. Nothing obvious. Just little adjustments. Sometimes she'd take longer to respond to messages than she used to. Sometimes plans that used to happen automatically now needed to be scheduled. Occasionally she seemed distracted during conversations, like part of her attention was somewhere else. At the time, I interpreted those things in the most generous way possible. Everyone gets busy. Everyone has stressful weeks. Relationships go through phases where things feel slightly out of sync. That's what I told myself. And to be fair, she never acted cold toward me. When we were together, things still felt mostly normal. She laughed at the same jokes. We still talked about random things late into the night. She still said she loved me. But there were moments when I noticed something subtle. A difference in how present she felt. Like she was there physically, but mentally balancing other things in the background. I remember one evening when we were sitting together and she checked her phone several times in a short span. Each time she turned the screen away slightly before replying. It was quick. Casual. The kind of thing most people wouldn't even notice. And honestly, at the time I didn't think much about it either. If anything, I felt a small flash of guilt for even registering it. Trust has a strange side effect like that. It makes you suspicious of your own instincts. So instead of questioning the moment, I pushed it aside. I told myself I was overthinking. The relationship was still good. Stable. Comfortable. And because I believed that, I kept investing in it the same way I always had. More time. More attention. More emotional energy. I didn't realize it then, but somewhere along the way the balance had shifted. I was slowly building my world around the relationship. And she was quietly building parts of her life that didn't include me. At the time, though, the difference between those two things still felt too small to matter. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The first thing that changed wasn't her behavior. It was the way I started noticing things. Before that point, our relationship moved along almost automatically. I didn't analyze her tone. I didn't question small details. If she said she was busy, I believed her. If plans shifted, it didn't bother me. Trust makes life simple like that. You don't investigate the person you believe in. But somewhere along the way, a quiet sense of discomfort started appearing in moments that should have felt normal. At first it was so subtle I almost ignored it completely. Little pauses. Small hesitations in conversations. Occasionally I would ask something simple, "How was your day?" And the answer would feel slightly rehearsed. Not wrong, exactly. Just shorter than usual. Busy. Nothing interesting. Just work stuff. Those kinds of answers. And maybe they were completely normal. People have uneventful days all the time. But the difference was that she used to tell me everything. Random details, small frustrations, stories about people I'd never met. Then gradually those details started disappearing. I noticed it, but I didn't treat it like a problem. Instead, I told myself something else had probably changed, maybe work had gotten stressful or she was just tired lately. Still, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it showed up in strange places. Sometimes when her phone buzzed, she'd glance down quickly and reply right away. Other times she'd flip the phone face down on the table before answering me. Again, nothing dramatic. People check their phones all the time. But there was a slight shift in how she held it now. A small awareness that hadn't existed before. Like she had started guarding it without realizing she was doing it. One night we were sitting together watching something neither of us was really paying attention to. Her phone lit up beside her. She looked at it quickly. For just a second her expression changed. Not panic. Not guilt. Just a brief flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Then she picked up the phone and stood up. "I'll be right back," she said. Her voice sounded normal. But she stepped into the other room to answer. That wasn't something she used to do. At the time I told myself it was probably a private conversation with a friend. Maybe someone needed advice or wanted to talk about something personal. I didn't follow her. I didn't listen at the door. I stayed exactly where I was. But I remember staring at the paused screen on the TV and feeling that strange discomfort again. The same crooked picture frame feeling. Something wasn't wrong enough to confront. But it wasn't right either. After that, moments like that started stacking on top of each other. She'd get messages late in the evening and respond quickly. Sometimes when I walked into the room, she'd close whatever was open on her phone. Once I jokingly asked, "Secret business over there?" She smiled. "Just nonsense," she said. The answer was casual enough that I let it go. But I noticed something else. When she laughed at those messages, the laugh sounded slightly different. It had the tone people use when they're sharing something privately with someone else. Not the kind of laugh you naturally include the person sitting next to you in. Again, I told myself I was reading too much into it. Relationships require trust. They require giving someone space to have parts of their life that don't revolve entirely around you. At least that's what I believed. So instead of questioning things, I kept adjusting my interpretation of the situation. Each small moment had a reasonable explanation on its own. Busy schedule. Private conversations. Random distractions. Nothing that could stand as proof of anything. But proof wasn't really the issue anymore. The problem was the accumulation. That growing sense that the relationship had developed areas I couldn't quite see into anymore. And the strangest part was that she never acted like anything was wrong. She still hugged me the same way. Still said she loved me. Still talked about plans weeks ahead like we always had. If someone had asked me then whether I trusted her, I would have said yes without hesitation. But late at night, when everything was quiet and those small moments replayed in my mind, I started realizing something uncomfortable. Trust hadn't disappeared. But it had started sharing space with something else. And once that second feeling appeared, it became impossible to pretend I didn't notice it. The moment everything finally broke wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting. No slammed doors. No sudden confession. Just a quiet moment that changed the meaning of everything that came before it. It happened on an ordinary evening. One of those nights where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. We were both home, moving through the usual routine without much conversation. She had stepped away for a minute, leaving her phone on the table. I remember noticing it only because the screen lit up. Normally I wouldn't have paid attention. I'd seen her phone light up 1,000 times before and never felt the need to look. But something about that moment felt different. Maybe it was the weeks of small discomfort that had been building. Maybe it was that strange instinct that had been whispering in the background for a while now. I glanced at the screen. At first it didn't even register as important. Just a message preview. A name I didn't recognize. Then I saw the sentence underneath it. It wasn't explicit. Nothing dramatic. Just a casual line that clearly belonged inside a conversation that had been going on for a while. Something about meeting up. Something about how much they had enjoyed the last time. I remember staring at the phone longer than I meant to. My brain was trying to place the information somewhere harmless. Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe it was an old friend I'd never heard about. Maybe there was some explanation that would make the message feel ordinary. But the longer I looked at it, the harder it became to pretend it was normal. Then another message appeared. This one made it clearer. Not graphic. Not over the top. But personal. Intimate in a way that didn't belong in casual conversation. That was the moment the entire structure of the relationship shifted in my mind. Suddenly those strange little moments from the past few weeks lined up perfectly. The guarded phone. The private calls. The distracted conversations. It all snapped together like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to finish. I didn't open the messages. I didn't scroll through anything. I didn't need to. The preview alone told me enough. And somehow that made it worse. Because it meant the truth had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. When she came back into the room, she noticed immediately that something was wrong. "Are you okay?" she asked. Her voice sounded calm. Normal. For a second I just looked at her. It's strange how someone can appear exactly the same on the outside even after you realize something fundamental about them has changed. I nodded toward the phone on the table. "That message," I said quietly. Her eyes moved to the screen. And I watched the exact moment she understood what had happened. The shift was subtle, but it was there. A small tightening in her expression. A pause that lasted half a second too long. Then she picked up the phone quickly. "It's not what you think," she said. That sentence always sounds the same, no matter who says it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of anything dramatic. I just asked one question. "How long?" She didn't answer right away. Instead she started explaining pieces of things that didn't fully connect. It wasn't serious. It just happened. It didn't mean anything. The words came out quickly, like she was trying to build a bridge across the gap that had suddenly opened between us. But the more she talked, the more obvious something became. This hadn't been one impulsive moment. It had taken time. Messages. Planning. Conversations I was never meant to see. A whole separate version of her life that existed right beside the one I thought we shared. I remember asking another question. "Did you ever plan on telling me?" That one seemed harder for her. She wiped her face and shook her head slightly. "I didn't know how," she said. Not yes. Not no. Just that. And in that moment, I realized something important. The person I trusted had been living two different realities at the same time. One where we were building something together. And another where I didn't exist at all. If you're watching this right now and you've ever had a moment where the truth suddenly rearranged your entire understanding of a relationship, then you know how disorienting it feels. 1 second you think you know your life. The next second everything looks different. If stories like this interest you, real experiences about betrayal, trust, and the complicated emotions that follow, make sure you subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray, like the video, and stick around. Because moments like this are usually only the beginning. And I was about to learn just how deep the damage really went. I looked back at her sitting across from me. She was already crying. And that's when the apologies started. The apologies came quickly. Faster than I expected. Almost like she had been rehearsing them somewhere in the back of her mind long before this moment ever happened. It meant nothing. It was a mistake. You're the one I love. She said those three things over and over again, sometimes in slightly different ways, but always circling back to the same idea. That what she had done didn't actually matter. I sat there listening, trying to understand how something that supposedly meant nothing could feel this heavy. She was crying harder than I had ever seen before. Not quiet tears. The kind where your whole body shakes and your words come out uneven. At one point she reached across the table like she wanted to grab my hand, but I pulled it back without thinking. Not aggressively. Just instinctively. Like touching her suddenly felt unfamiliar. "I'll do anything," she said. "Therapy. Counseling. Whatever you want." She kept talking about fixing things, about rebuilding trust, about how we could get through this if we worked together. For a brief moment, part of me wanted to believe her. Not because the explanation made sense, but because believing it would have been easier than accepting what was actually happening. The mind does strange things when it's trying to protect itself. It searches for ways to keep the old reality alive just a little longer. But every time she said, it didn't mean anything, my thoughts kept drifting back to the messages I had seen. Not just the words themselves. The tone. The familiarity. The way two people speak when they've been talking for a while. That kind of conversation doesn't appear out of nowhere. It builds. Slowly. Choice after choice. Message after message. Moment after moment where someone decides to keep going instead of stopping. A mistake happens once. This had required effort. Planning. Time that existed somewhere outside the life I thought we were sharing. I asked her one thing. "Did you think about me while it was happening?" She didn't answer immediately. Her silence said more than anything else she could have said. Eventually she shook her head slightly. "I tried not to think about it like that," she whispered. That sentence settled heavily in the room. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest in a way the other explanations weren't. She hadn't forgotten about me. She had simply placed me somewhere outside the situation. Like two different compartments in her life that were never supposed to collide. Until they did. The apologies kept coming. "I hate myself for this. I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I swear it'll never happen again." The strange thing was, none of those promises made me feel better. If anything, they made something clearer. She wasn't apologizing because she had suddenly realized the damage the moment it happened. She was apologizing because the damage was finally visible. Because the secret had run out of places to hide. I started noticing something in the way she spoke. Every sentence revolved around losing me. Losing the relationship. Losing the life we had built. Very little of it focused on the choices themselves. That realization sat quietly in my mind while she continued pleading. And slowly another thought formed. Sometimes regret isn't really about remorse. Sometimes it's about fear. Fear of consequences. Fear of being alone. Fear of losing the comfort of the life you already had. As I watched her sitting there, crying and apologizing, I realized something uncomfortable. Her words sounded like love. But the feeling behind them didn't quite match. They felt closer to desperation. And once that thought appeared, it became impossible to ignore. The strange thing about betrayal is that the moment you discover it isn't actually the moment you understand it. That part comes later. At first everything just feels loud inside your head. Thoughts bouncing into each other, trying to make sense of something that doesn't fit with the life you thought you were living. But after the confrontation, after the tears and the promises and the long conversations that circle the same points over and over, something else starts to happen. Things get quiet. Not peaceful. Just quiet. In the days that followed, we talked a lot. Or maybe a better way to say it is that she talked and I listened. She repeated the same explanations in different forms. It was stupid. I wasn't thinking. I wish I could take it back. Sometimes she'd say the other person didn't matter at all. That it had been meaningless from the start. Other times she described it like something that had gotten out of control before she realized what was happening. The explanations shifted depending on the moment. But one thing stayed the same. Every version of the story tried to make the choices sound smaller than they actually were. And at first, I think part of me wanted to accept that. Not because it made sense, but because the alternative was harder. The alternative meant acknowledging that someone I trusted had repeatedly stepped outside the relationship while still standing inside it. It meant accepting that two realities had existed side by side. The one I was living in. And the one she never showed me. Over time, though, the emotional fog started clearing. Little by little. Distance has a way of doing that. It separates the feelings from the facts. And when the facts stand on their own, they tend to look different. I started thinking less about what she was saying now and more about what had actually happened before I found out. The messages hadn't appeared overnight. The conversations hadn't started and ended in a single moment. There had been opportunities to stop. Opportunities to tell the truth. Opportunities to step back and protect the relationship. Instead, the secret had grown quietly. One conversation leading to another. One decision creating the next one. Until it eventually became something that needed to be hidden. And that's when another realization started settling in. People often say they regret hurting someone. But sometimes what they really regret is the moment their actions stop being private. The moment consequences enter the picture. I didn't know exactly where her regret came from. Maybe there was genuine remorse buried somewhere inside it. Or maybe the regret was tied to losing the life we had built together. The truth was, I couldn't measure it. All I could measure were the choices that had already been made. And once those choices were visible, they couldn't be unseen. In a strange way, that realization brought a kind of clarity. Painful clarity. But clarity nonetheless. Because it forced me to stop focusing on the apologies and start focusing on the pattern that existed before them. And once I started seeing the situation that way, something inside me shifted. The relationship I thought I had been protecting wasn't actually there anymore. What remained was the decision about what to do with that truth. Before we get to the final part of the story, I want to hear from you. If you've ever experienced something like this, or if you've ever had to decide whether someone's regret was genuine, drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy real stories about trust, betrayal, and the complicated decisions that follow, make sure you subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray and like the video. Because the hardest part of moments like this isn't discovering the truth. It's deciding what that truth means for the rest of your life. And I still hadn't fully answered that question yet. In the weeks after everything happened, people kept asking me the same question. What are you going to do? At first I didn't have an answer. Not because I was confused about what had happened. That part was painfully clear. The messages, the conversations, the choices that led up to them, none of that could be undone. The real question was what any of it meant now. She kept trying to fix things. Some days she would send long messages explaining how sorry she was. Other days she'd ask if we could talk again, like maybe there was still some version of the relationship we could rebuild if we just found the right words. I know I broke your trust, she told me once. But people make mistakes. We can move forward. I remember sitting there reading that message for a long time. Because the word mistake kept standing out to me. A mistake is something accidental. A wrong turn on a road. Sending a message to the wrong person. Forgetting something important. But the more I thought about what had actually happened, the harder it was to fit that word into the situation. This hadn't been one moment. It had been a series of decisions. Time spent talking. Plans made. Parts of her life that had been carefully separated from the part she shared with me. And the strange thing is, I still don't believe she woke up one day intending to destroy the relationship. Most betrayals probably don't start that way. They start small. A conversation that feels harmless. A little attention from someone new. A decision that seems insignificant at the time. Then another one. Then another. Until eventually you've built something in the shadows that can't survive in the open. And when it finally comes into the light, people often say the same things. It meant nothing. It didn't matter. You're the one I really love. But that's the part one keeps thinking about. If it truly meant nothing, why protect it with so many secrets? Why risk something real for something that supposedly had no value? That question stayed with me long after the conversations ended. Because it forced me to realize something uncomfortable. Sometimes people don't betray you because they stopped loving you. Sometimes they betray you because, in certain moments, protecting their own desires matters more than protecting your trust. And that's a much harder truth to sit with. I don't hate her. I don't even believe she wanted to hurt me. But intention doesn't erase choices. And trust, once it's broken in a deliberate way, doesn't return just because someone wishes it would. In the end, the hardest part wasn't discovering the truth. It was accepting that the person I believed in was capable of living a completely different reality at the same time. Maybe some people can rebuild after something like that. Maybe forgiveness works differently for everyone. But there's one question I still think about. When someone says the betrayal meant nothing, does that make it easier to forgive? Or does it make the choice to betray feel even more deliberate?